Symposium with a presentation about the 7/7 event, 9/11, and all the rest of it. And now, a year on, there's a lot more to say, I'm sure. And I know Ian has a very powerful presentation for you. So, we're now going to welcome you to Mr. Ian Crane.
Go there, see. Fantastic. Had you fooled? War! What is it good for? Pathetic. Fluffy bunnies, the lot of you. Okay, let's try it again. Now, we don't want any Middle England, absolutely nothing. Let's have a full-blooded Mid-Atlantic, absolutely nothing. So, war! What is it good for? That's a bit better, because you're going to get a chance to practice it a little while. If we can find the right presentation here. Unfortunately, I can't see it on my screen, so I've got to do it this way. Right. So don't worry about where I am in the room. When you hear me go, war, what is it good for? What's your response? Oh, good God. I can see this is going to be hard work. Let's run it and see what happens.
The logic of
Are you awake now? That's the least of your worries. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with 11:11, yes? Or 1:11, or 2:22, or 3:33. When we're in this stream, this is one of the first indications that we are following a particular path. And just to confirm that for me, the ticket number that I picked up when I checked in yesterday was ticket number 111. Affirmation. I've heard the presentations earlier today, and I relate to both. I am 20 years in the oil industry, before retiring from the oil industry, that is. I've lived and worked in the Middle East, mainland Europe, and in North America. My partner is Texan. My stepdaughter was born in Texas. All of my in-laws live in the Deep South, and they all think George Bush is doing a good job. I have worked with not necessarily every nationality on the globe, but with a lot, in some very, very hostile environments. I've been through some very challenging situations. A customs officer dropping drugs in my bag in Lagos Airport in Nigeria. £50 sorted out that problem. Went on my expenses as a special immigration tax. But I have never come across belligerence. I do not believe that there is natural belligerence in man. Even when in Hassi Massoud in 1990, I had 2 of my employees beheaded by the local terrorists. It would have been a third, but one of the local employees stepped forward just before the guy was about to swing the sword and said, "Stop, he's a good Muslim." He converted. He hadn't, but this guy put his own life on the line, potentially, to stop the expat, who was a Frenchman, being executed. Up until 9/11, I had no real interest in geopolitics. I was aware of what was going on. I was in the Middle East during the first Gulf War. I was very aware that it was the American Special Forces who set alight most of the oil wells in southern Kuwait. It was a deliberate ploy to get the Emir of Kuwait to pay US companies for the firefighting exercise. It didn't really bother me that much. When I did question it, somebody simply said, "Ian, aren't you getting paid enough?" And I shrugged and got on with my job. But 9/11 crossed the line. And it started a process of some serious research. And what I want to do this afternoon is introduce you to some of my findings as to what I think is going on. Because I'm reminded very much of the conversation that Lloyd George had with the then editor of the Manchester Evening News in 1916, at the height of the First World War. And of course, at that time, Britain was very much losing the First World War. And his comment was, if the people knew the truth, this war would end tomorrow. But they won't know, and they can't know. And my research suggests that there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the vast majority of people caught on either side of any conflict really have no desire to be involved in that conflict. But there are other machinations occurring that are way outside of their influence. And what I'm going to introduce you today is perhaps some of those aspects that are outside. Because I agree with Paulden, if it was left to the Israelis, the vast majority, I'm male, I can't think and chew gum at the same time, so I have to stop talking while I do this. Where was I? So let's start with the current situation. It's very reminiscent of 1914, the July crisis of 1914. The smelly stuff hit the fan in 1914, just as Parliament was about to go on its summer recess. Déjà vu. Yeah? Countries in the West, because of the vacations, are leaderless. Well, leaderless. Tony Blair goes on vacation, and we have at the helm of the country for the next 14 weeks or so Jags, who has proven on many occasions can barely string a sentence together at the dispatch box, let alone on TV. But this is the guy that we have in charge. Now, recently, we had a foreign secretary who actually showed a bit of backbone because he went against the government policy, although he may, of course, be very conscious of what occurred with his predecessor, who also went against government policy, who a few weeks after denouncing the government's policy for invading Iran, found himself the victim of a coronary on a mountainside in Scotland. But Jack Straw did have the courage to say to launch a nuclear attack on Iran would be ludicrous. A few weeks later, of course, he was out of the job. So then we have appointed in his place Margaret Beckett, who I think gets all of her information on foreign policy from Caravan Monthly, which is probably marginally better than those who read Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun. I won't ask you to put your hands up if you know Trevor Kavanagh. But Margaret Beckett even had the backbone to denounce the fact that the American forces were transshipping armaments to Israel through UK airports. And she said, this is unacceptable. But then her boss got in on the game and suggested that perhaps she might want to temper that. And in a later interview, she said, I think it's safe to assume that the transshipments will continue. In the course of my work, I've had the opportunity to come into contact with some amazing people, one of whom actually ends up living fairly close to me, a guy called Dr. David Halpin. He's one of the 3 medical professionals who actually wrote to The Guardian in the aftermath of Dr. Kelly's death, stating that it was medically impossible for David Kelly to have committed suicide in the way it was described on the death certificate. That's one of his activities. He also has now made 5 trips to Palestine. He has a charity called The Dove and the Dolphin. And he came back from his 5th trip recently, and I'd asked him to give a presentation, which he's giving in Totnes next week, on his experiences. For nearly 2 months after his trip to Palestine, he was completely depleted. I mean, it was not like the David Halpin that I had got to know. The experience shocked him to the core. But I admire the man. I mean, he has the courage of his convictions. He spends a lot of his time commuting between the West Country and London, lobbying MPs, lobbying state departments, foreign embassies, to try and get the situation amended in Palestine. Now, I absolutely concur with Pauden's observation that this would end tomorrow if it was left to the people of the Levant. But there are some other very, very powerful agendas at play. Now, I don't have the opportunity or the time this afternoon to discuss all of those agendas. There are some very, very strange bedfellows right now, and they all think they're manipulating each other, and it's actually difficult to see who's in the lead role sometimes. But what I'm going to do is take you on a journey right back to the beginning of recorded history, because I think that's where we actually have to start to maybe understand the belief system of some of the players who are scripting what's occurring in the world right now. But I can't go any further without mentioning again this document, the Project for a New American Century. I mentioned it last year, and I told you last year that this was the blueprint for everything that was going to occur. So if any of you haven't yet read it, it is freely available. And one of the reasons that it is out there is because when these guys put information out for people to access and to read and to understand, and then they do nothing, in the occult realm, we give them our power. So this is a deliberate strategy to document exactly what they intend to do. Now, this document, I'm not going to go through it in detail. I may make a couple of quotes from it as we go through the presentation. But on reading it, if you didn't know who the authors were, you would think it was a work of science fiction. I mean, you would think it was the work of, some pretty incredible, maybe perverse individual, who had gone 1984 and some. I mean, it is completely ignorant of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, of culture, of alternative belief systems. I mean, it is totally spiritually bankrupt. But when you look at the authors, this guy was the chairman. Anybody in here know who this guy is? John Bolton. Now, John Bolton was the chairman of the group that put this document together, and the document was published in September of 2000. So 2 months before George Bush was appointed president by the democratic process of the Supreme Court appointing him on a vote of 5-3. John Bolton, 2 months later, is the guy who walked into the Tallahassee courtroom in Florida and said, "Hey, I'm with the Bush team, and I'm here to shut down the recount." Any vested interest, perhaps? Do you know what John Bolton is doing today? He is the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And immediately he got in the job, he put in 750 amendments. I mean, the tactic was completely to shut down the effectiveness of the United Nations. Who else do we have on this team? Donald Rumsfeld. Anybody? Actually, there's a better picture of Donald Rumsfeld coming up right here. Oh, yes, my friend. Now, we all know about Donald Rumsfeld, right? Mr. Aspartame. This is the guy, I mean, I could go back even further. He was the guy who, with Dick Cheney, forced Gerald Ford to kick Nelson Rockefeller out of the White House when President Ford had taken over from Nixon. But in the late 70s, he was chairman and chief executive officer of Searle. Searle was the manufacturer of aspartame, or as some people in the States call it, aspartame. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the States, had tested aspartame and had seen that it was the cause of brain cancer and brain tumors in rats. So the FDA refused to give it a license. Donald Rumsfeld and Searle, they financed very significantly Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign. Within 48 hours of Ronald Reagan being sworn in to the presidency, Ronald Reagan had removed the head of the FDA and replaced him with a guy that Donald Rumsfeld has put forward, and 2 weeks later, aspartame was given license. Today, aspartame in many states in the US is banned in drinks that are marketed to the under 12s. But here they're freely available. And then, of course, bird flu. Now, in the US, this is incredible. I was in the US a few weeks ago at a conference in Chicago, and I picked up USA Today, and every day in the paper it has, "These people died of bird flu in Indonesia." Excuse me, but I'm going to use a technical term, bullshit. This is all geared towards creating the fear. SARS didn't work. SARS has a very interesting connotation, as I might touch on later, but here we have bird flu as the new sort of fear. Now, I wouldn't touch Tamiflu with the proverbial barge pole. Tamiflu is I think, the potential genetically targeted chemicals that they talk about in the Project for a New American Century. But Tamiflu is the symptom suppressant for bird flu. It's your only hope of survival. I thought, hang on a second, this doesn't hang up. So we did a quick bit of research. This is back last sort of September or so when this first hit the media. It didn't take too long to find out that Donald Rumsfeld had been the chairman and chief executive officer of Gilead between 1995 and 2000, when he was appointed into 2001, when he was appointed into the White House. And Gilead had developed Tamiflu and then sold the marketing rights to Roche. So needless to say, all the Tamiflu that has been sold around the world in the last sort of few months, this guy has made significant benefit from. These are some of the other villains. Paul Wolfowitz, very quickly, who was under Secretary of Defense, reporting into Donald Rumsfeld. He's now head of the World Bank. Dick Cheney, of course, was head of Halliburton. Halliburton has become one of the most successful companies since the invasion of Iraq. Scooter Libby Lewis, currently being indicted for releasing the name of Valerie Plame. John Negroponte, who will be well known to anybody here from Central America because he was the guy who was behind all the death squads in Central America, and particularly in Honduras. And when he was appointed U.S. ambassador to Iraq, the Hondurans said, if he is appointed, we're going to pull out our troops. Well, they only had 1,500 in the coalition, but they did pull them out. This guy here, very interesting, Richard Armitage, he was the deputy to Colin Powell. He was the guy who made sure that Colin Powell was in South America when 9/11 went down. Because Colin Powell was potentially, a wobbler. So they made sure he was out of the country. Interestingly enough, they made sure another guy who they weren't too sure about was in country. And on September the 10th, they gave John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, they invited him over to Washington and presented him with some bullshit award. But they did that deliberately so that he was in the US when September the 11th went down. And this guy here, Dov Zakheim, this is the guy who was comptroller of the Pentagon. And remember, as I said yesterday, I am a coincidence theorist. I look for coincidences. Dov Zakheim was the comptroller of the Pentagon, and on September the 10th, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld and Dov Zakheim made a press release announcing that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion. $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States, a country that already has a national debt of over $9 trillion, $8 trillion at the time, now over 9. Incredible. Incredible. Anyway, pathocracy, government by psychopaths. The term pathocracy was coined by a psychologist who's an octogenarian. He's 88 years of age, and he'd spent much of his early life in Poland. Probably because he was Polish. Makes sense. He's written a dissertation called Ponerology, and he uses the term ponerology to describe the manifestation of evil in politics. And he's looked at how people are identified very early on in their careers, and then they are effectively guided by the powers that be into their positions, and they are molded. Blair and Cameron fit exactly the bill that he describes. Gordon Brown doesn't. It's my bet that Gordon Brown will not be allowed to become Prime Minister for more than probably a year. He may well be given a year just to sort of see how far they can push him. But I think Gordon Brown probably has some substance. I'd like to think so anyway. And I think that he will lose the election. And Cameron is being groomed to take over from Blair. So we have pathocracy for sure. Let's go back. We're going to do a very, very quick journey here for sure. Recorded history through multiple civilizations kicks in at around about the year 3100. The Sumerian kicks in a little bit earlier, around about 3600. The Jewish calendar takes us back to 3760. And Anno Lucis, for those of you who are not aware, is the Masonic calendar. Anno Lucis, after Lucifer. And for the Masons, we are in the year 4000. We're in the year 6006 BC, because they kicked their calendar off at 4000. Probably taking it from Bishop Ussher, who, of course, got his start date by working through the genealogy in the Bible. But I want to hold on to the Sumerians, because the Sumerians provide us with the earliest recorded stories, mythology. Now, for some of you, I'm talking in mythological terms. Some of you, I'm talking theoretical terms, some allegorical, some maybe literal. I will leave that to you to decide where it fits. This is Lawrence Gardner's handiwork, actually. It's the family tree of the Anunnaki. Are you aware of the story of the Anunnaki? Okay. Well, we take the creation myth of man from the Enuma Elish, which, very briefly, tells us that the Anunnaki came to Earth many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago to mine gold. And they needed the gold to put into their atmosphere to protect their planet, because their planet is on an incredible elliptical orbit. It's part of our solar system, but it goes way out into deep space. And then every 3,600 years, which is in Sumerian language, asar, every 3,600 years it comes back in very close orbit to the planets in our solar system. And they were mining the gold, and for many hundreds of thousands of years, they were using their own people. And then they were obviously developing genetic technology. So the people, the miners, said, hey guys, listen, we know you've got the technology to genetically engineer some miners, some slaves. So why don't you help us out here? We don't have to do this stuff. Well, the two rulers of Earth at that time were Enki and Enlil. Now, Enki and his partner Ninhursag were the creators, according to the Sumerian texts. They were the creators of man. Now, they didn't get it right first time, which is why we have in many, many mythologies around the world that we are in the fourth sun, or in some cases the fifth sun. So that on each of these previous suns, they took the opportunity to, effectively wipe out their creations and start again. And they were about to do it one more time in fairly recent history, estimated actually at around about 9,500 BC, 11,000 years ago or so, 11,500 years ago, when the planet Nibiru, the Anunnaki homeland, was going to come in close orbit to the Earth. And they knew that this was going to cause a massive tidal wave. And Enlil, who was not the creator of man, but he was effectively marginally senior to his stepbrother, Enki, and he was a bit fed up because Enki had actually sort of given these human creations the power to procreate. And it was their lovemaking that kept him awake at night. Probably lived upstairs from me. I was just imagining that. So Enlil said, let's take this as an opportunity. Let's start again. Let's wipe them out. But Enki actually felt that this creation was pretty damn good. It was, really about as close as he felt he could get to perfection. So he was a bit dubious about letting the effects of the planet coming into close orbit to the Earth and creating a massive tidal wave and wiping out mankind. He balked. And he said, look, yes, I'm going to contact this guy called Utnapishtim. That's Noah in the Hebrew version. And Utnapishtim was a chosen one of Enki. And Enki gave Utnapishtim the dimensions to build not an ark, but a submarine. Because in the Sumerian story, texts, he covers this ark with pitch, even the hatch. And he doesn't take the animals in 2 by 2, he takes in the DNA. Unfortunately, it gets sort of, translated by other cultures a bit later on, and then we end up with the animals coming in 2 by 2. So this occurred, and Enlil, after discovering that there had been survivors, did relent, and then allowed Utnapishtim and the descendants that he had with him in the submarine to repopulate the earth. Now, this is a creation story. Now, the Orthodox Christians, etc., of course, dismiss this because it doesn't fit in with the biblical account. But actually, it probably does, except that we actually have a slightly different name here. We have Enki as opposed to Jehovah. So Joseph Campbell actually identified that there's 175 myths of a flood around the world in various cultures. And in his research, he could only link, even tenuously, he could only link 75 of them to the Hebrew version. So he effectively determined that the flood story was pretty much a historical account. And these are the other gods who are also credited with identifying a chosen individual and then being saved. Now, after Enki and Enlil had been on Earth for many, many thousands of years, they actually started to assign different areas of the globe to their descendants. And we know that, for example, Ra, who's Marduk, who was the son of Enki, was given Egypt. And then life went on, and there's no significant change until around about 1530 BC, when we have Akhenaten, who established this monotheistic religion in Egypt, totally against the grain of the Aeneid, the pantheon of the 9 gods. Now, many researchers, many scholars have actually linked either directly or indirectly, closely but indirectly, Akhenaten with the Exodus. Some even suggesting that Akhenaten was actually Moses. I mean, Moses is a title. It means heir apparent. It's not a name. So at this juncture, this is when we have effectively the manifestation of monotheism. It didn't really fit with the Egyptian consciousness at that time, and Moses, whether it was or wasn't, Akhenaten is academic for this point, but at that point we have the Exodus, and the monotheists were effectively evicted out of Egypt. And then they hook up with this god on Mount Sinai, or Mount Musa in the Sinai, where Moses goes up the mountain, meets with the guy who doesn't really introduce himself properly, but he gives Moses the 10 suggestions. And they had to be suggestions. I mean, I think commandments must be a mistranslation. Because, just a few years later, there was Moses and Aaron and Joshua standing looking at Canaan, and God said, hey, this is all yours. And they said, well, hang on a second. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's. Yeah, but it's only for everybody else. Go take that land. And we find ourselves still suffering, if you like, from that decision, some 3,500 years later. And it was a conquest, because over the next few hundred years, I mean, they literally, the people of the Exodus literally took that land city by city, town by town, destruction upon destruction. Let's move forward to 300, just a little, the 4th century BC. Alexander the Great effectively conquered the known world at that time. But one of the legacies that he left was the creation of the library in Alexandria. And what he demanded that all of the travelers and merchants from Alexandria did was that they collect all the works of wisdom from the known world and bring them into Alexandria. And the library was established in 320 BCE. So let's roll forward to sort of 320 years, and we come to a period that we know as the period of Christ. Now, different people in the room are going to have different perceptions. To some, Christ was a scholar, a learned individual. To some, he was the Son of God. To some, he's a complete mythological individual. But for the purpose of this discussion, let's assume that he was a scholar. Because by the time he visited Alexandria, and we know he went to Egypt, of course, but we have these 18 missing years in the accounts that we do have, and it's a pretty fair bet that he spent a chunk of that time in Alexandria. Because let's understand and let's accept and acknowledge that nothing that he taught in the Levant was original. It was all wisdom, some of it in some cases word for word of the Buddha. So, I mean, it proves to me that if he lived, he was a great scholar, and he took that wisdom. Now, why did he take it? He took it into the Levant. We know he was born in that area. Well, let me cast a suggestion here that when he took it into the Levant, and when he said to his people, I am here to free you from bondage. Now, many theological scholars will tell you that that statement referred to the bondage that the Jews were under from the Romans. I'm here to tell you that that statement was that he was there to release the Jews from the bondage of their jealous God. Their jealous God being Enlil, the stepbrother of Enki. Enki being the true creator of man. This is the lady who was the chief scientist, librarian, philosopher of the library in Alexandria. She actually took over from her father. And I'm going to come back to her in a second, because I do want to talk about Carl Jung very briefly, because one of the great things about Egyptian wisdom that was lost to us was the great teaching of Egyptian wisdom was that the most important relationship that you could develop was the relationship with your divine Ka, your higher self. And that was brought back to us in the 20th century by Carl Jung, who spent his life absolutely scared shitless that anybody would find out that he had this relationship with this consciousness that he referred to as Philemon. And this is actually Carl Jung's own drawings of Philemon. But he recognized that Philemon was his higher self. And it is Jung's wisdom that has helped us to understand that Egyptian mystery school teaching and the relationship, the importance of the relationship with the higher self, because the higher self is effectively the interface that we have with all the other realms. It works on the same basis as the sort of Houston space trips. When the astronauts are up in space, they've got all these people, all these technicians who all want to sort of get their word in with the astronauts. So rather than having them all chattering away, there is one guy, and everything has to come through one guy, and he decides the priorities. And that basically is the way the higher self can work. I think we can actually be very, very clear and pinpoint specifically the start of the Dark Ages. And this is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. When Constantine was outside of Rome, Maxentius was inside. Constantine was a bit short in numbers. And somebody suggested that there was a lot of Christians out there who, if they could pull them into our ranks, we might have the numbers to take over Maxentius. In return, of course, he promised to make Christianity the official religion of Rome. We had the Council of Nicaea because even Constantine could see that the diverse views of the Christians were not conducive with a state religion. So he demanded that they meet and they thrash out the canonical Bible. And it was a horse trade. That's why there's so many contradictions in the Bible. Because it was a case of, hey, listen, I'll support you in your book if you support me in mine. The fact that mine doesn't totally agree with yours, in fact, it's totally contrary, is irrelevant, as long as it's in the canon. And that was the start. A few years later, the Christian monks under Bishop Cyril in Alexandria destroyed the Library of Alexandria. I would suggest that there's a lot of works from Alexandria in the vaults of the Vatican today. And I hope that in the not too distant future that we have access to them. I'm not holding my breath, but I'll come back to why that may be the case in a little while. Now, Hypatia was the chief scientist at that time, and she was brutally murdered. And the reason she was murdered was because she was seen as a threat to the New World Order, the New World Order being the Orthodox Christian Church. And one of the things that I have certainly uncovered in my research, and I appreciate this may be controversial, but it's my research, so I'm going to tell you, there is absolutely nothing Christian about the Roman Church. There are many Christians in the Roman Church. There's no question about that. There are many good Christians in the Roman Church, but there is nothing fundamentally Christian about the Roman Church. Now, the Roman Church set about destroying the ancient wisdom, making sure that it could not be accessed. From the time that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, we lost the ability to read the hieroglyphs. And that's something that we didn't recover until the 19th century. But the wisdom was retained. And because of the oppression of the Roman Church, it had to be retained in secret. And the Knights Templar, some say they were founded a little bit earlier, but fundamentally the Knights Templar was just a group of 9. Don't be fooled by the myths about them being the protectors of the pilgrims. That was the Knights Hospitalier. But the Knights Templar were after something. And what was it? Yeah, Graham Hancock is here tomorrow, and he may touch on his research because maybe they were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Sacred geometry. And we see here in London evidence of sacred geometry in the London architecture. This is the pyramid on top of the pillar, and the pillars are representing the two pillars at the front of the Temple of Solomon, Boaz and Jachin. And this was believed, ancient wisdom, to bring energy into the earth. And one of the reasons that Tony Blair was so adamant that the dome was going to be built was to obtain the symmetry here between the male and the female. Here's the female, here's the male, the pillar, and Boaz and Jachin. The desire to bring energy into the city of London and abuse it. See the representation here in the Kabbalah. Yeah? The two pillars. The masculine, the feminine, the balance. This is Boaz, Jachin, and then the pillar here. And the Masonic symbol of the compass and the square, because this is from the pyramid. You will have seen that yesterday if you were here for Alan Orford's presentation. Notice the similarity here. You know? And the Templars revere the pyramid. Yeah? Now we know the Egyptian wisdoms definitely went into Egypt with Moses. Moses was a master of the Egyptian mystery schools. And he would have very definitely passed that on, although he didn't go into Israel himself. He would have passed it on to Aaron or to Joshua. Was it the use of the dodecahedron grid, what some people call the Christ consciousness? Certainly, this wisdom exists within the secret societies because it was used to pinpoint the location for the Pentagon. It's a real enigma, isn't it? The Pentagon being used, or the Christ consciousness being used to bring energy into the Pentagon. You know, Plato said geometry, rightly treated, is the knowledge of the eternal. So, you know, Plato, who also made the observation that we Greeks are but children to you Egyptians, so he recognized the importance of the geometry. Was it the bloodline? Of course, very topical at the moment with Dan Brown's novel and Holy Blood, Holy Grail getting back into the bestsellers list. Let me tell you, in my opinion, this is misinformation. This is disinformation. This is deliberately to throw people off the track. But it could be, you know, the bloodline of Christ through the Magdalene. But there's a reference in the Bible that most theologians will stay well clear of. And it is Genesis chapter 6, where it says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Because the Anunnaki lived for many thousands of years. Now we say, oh, it's ridiculous. They can't have lived for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Yesterday we heard Hamish Miller talking about the crickets and the cricket life cycle of a day. You know, and there are some life forms that have a life cycle of less than a day. So our 8,000 weeks, if we lived to 80, we live 4,000 weeks. So that's 28,000 days. So there are some life forms that we have a life cycle of 28,000 times their life cycle. So multiply our life cycle by 28,000. It's a big number. There's other references as well in books that didn't make it to the Bible. In Enoch, we have the reference, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw them, handsome and beautiful daughters, and desired them. And they were altogether 200, and they descended into Ardos, which is the summit of Hermon, Mount Hermon. And they called the Mount Hermon, for they swore and bound one another by a curse. They were bound to this physical realm. And then the book of Jared, which we have access to via the limited information that's still been released from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the days of Jared, 200 watchers descended on Ardis, the summit of Mount Hermon. On this mountain, the watchers swore an oath and bound themselves to it. The watchers, the descendants of the Anunnaki, who were locked here for whatever reason, they were locked into the physical realm. Here is Mount Hermon. Any idea where Mount Hermon is? Oh, it's between Lebanon and Syria. Yes. It's in Lebanon, just north of the Israeli border with Lebanon and just west of the border with Syria, right in the area that we're fighting over, or we're not fighting over, is being fought over right now. Maybe there's more to this than meets the eye. Andrew Collins, who spoke here last year, has written an excellent book on the Watchers. And there is a lot of discussion and debate as to who the Watchers were. But I think the general consensus is that they were part of the Anunnaki, and they were effectively sentenced to be locked into the physical realm of Earth. Now, some of the ancient wisdom has been sustained through time, despite the attempts to suppress it. And I'll just latch on one because of the time, but Giordano Bruno came to England and came that close to convincing Queen Elizabeth I to make effectively the Egyptian religion the religion of the UK. But of course the priests had other ideas. Giordano Bruno left the UK, went back to Italy, where he met the fate of all heretics at that time and was burned. Now, we have come into a period over the last 200 years where the ancient wisdom has been returned to us. Starting around about the 1820s with Jean-François Champollion and his deciphering of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Interestingly enough, when he was 7 years of age, he told his parents that he had come here to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, when he was 7, that was 1897, the Rosetta Stone wasn't discovered until 1899. And the Rosetta Stone was, of course, absolutely critical to his work. The wisdom has been retained, though, within the secret societies. And this symbol here, which is on the back of the dollar bill, and it represents the separated capstone from the pyramid. And what this represents is that the knowledge shall be the domain of the few, the domain of the elite. And the masses will be separated from that knowledge. Refer back to Lloyd George's comment to the editor of the Manchester Evening News. There is no question. It's spelt out in words of one syllable here. George Bush Sr. made the comment on September the 11th, 1990 and 1991. In two separate speeches, he stated, there will be a new world order. September the 11th, 1990 and 1991, 11 and 10 years before 9/11. The objectives are very clear. It's one world government, one world economy, one world religion. And as was spelt out, as Andy stated this morning, I think it's Dr. Ted Andrews, in Texas, a desired population, a global population of less than 1 billion. And they make no bones about it. The US has a eugenics program in a number of states. No other country in the world practices eugenics. Now, just wanted to touch here with Hypatia a second. Does that look familiar? That relief? This is the only known relief of Hypatia, by the way. How about this one? Diana was Tony Blair's blooding. 3 months after he was appointed to the position of Prime Minister of the UK, this was his blooding to oversee the murder of Princess Di. They had to take her out. Had she connected with her higher self, which of course, as we know, normally occurs around, give or take, the age of 40. She was 37 at the time. They knew who she was. They knew that once she accessed the higher self, she would be unstoppable. Do you know what her next 2 roles were to be after August 31st, 1997? The following week, the following day, she was due to give a presentation on anti-personnel landmines. And the week after that, she was scheduled to go to Palestine and make a documentary on the children of Palestine. A very, very powerful player who, for the New World Order, needed to be taken out. So what is the bloodline? What bloodline is being protected? Yes, it is a bloodline, but it has nothing to do with the bloodline of Christ or the bloodline of the Magdalene. It's the bloodline of the Watchers. It's the bloodline of those who are locked in to this physical realm. Now, I'm not asking you to believe this. I don't necessarily believe it myself. This is their belief system. This is the belief system of the secret societies, the upper echelons of the secret societies. What they call the blue degrees, the first, second, and third degrees of Masons, they have no idea about what I'm talking about. This is information that is kept for the higher degrees, like 32 and 33rd degrees of Masonry. You know, and these guys are getting cocky because this was the bus on July 7th last year. This was on the side. Outright terror, bold and brilliant. And you know what? These guys are saying, you know, we know there's some of you out there who know what we're doing. We know. And you know what? It might be 100, it might be 500, it might be 1,000, it might be 10,000, it might be 100,000, it might be 1,000,000 or 2, but it's not enough. It's not enough. They are raising the game. The pattern, I talked last year about the reason I was able to identify this was a false flag terror job was because the template of 9/11 could be overlaid on 7/7. I'm not going to regurgitate that. It's on my DVD, which is outside. The same template can be overlaid in Bali, in Mumbai. These guys are deliberately setting about an agenda of disruption, of chaos. The motto of the Brotherhood, Ordo ab Chaos, order out of chaos. It's the Hegelian dialectic of create the problem, offer the reaction, and then ultimately the solution. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This crop circle appeared just after 7/7 last year. It's the six-pointed star, the symbol of Zionism. The Israeli flag, I haven't got the Israeli flag up there, but with the possible exception of the Irish flag, it is the only flag that states categorically its territorial objectives, because the Israeli flag has a blue line below the Star of David and a blue line above. And that represents the desire to greater Israel, all the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. Greater Israel. And Mount Hermon is right there. Right there. Slap bang in the middle. Now, something very interesting about Mount Hermon. It sits at 33.53 degrees east and 33.53 degrees north. Now, if you go to Google Earth and you check out those numbers, you'll come back and you say, no, it doesn't. Well, it does. When you use the meridian, the rose line meridian of Paris. The zero meridian was not changed to Greenwich until, I think, 1886. So up until then, the zero meridian was through Paris. If you take Paris, Mount Hermon sits at 33.53 and 33.53 degrees. Now, there's something else here. 33.53 degrees is exactly 2012 nautical miles. Mount Hermon sits 2012 nautical miles east of the zero meridian and north of the equator. Have the knowledge that the Templars brought back, was it the coding as to the point of return of the Watchers or their masters? Were they sentenced perhaps to 5,500 years on this earth? The other belief system of the pathocracy, the players at the senior level in the hierarchies, is that they believe they are totally locked into this physical realm. And they believe that's the price they have to pay. And normally, in normal human nature, is that as people get older, they become more mellow, they become more chilled. They don't even want to kill the grandkids anymore. They're quite relaxed. But with these guys, they become more brutal, more vicious. Because their belief system is that the more they do in this current incarnation to further the agenda of their bloodline, the higher up they will come back in the pecking order when they reincarnate. That is their belief system, that they will stay in control. When the US produced a document called Securing the Realm, they're not talking about the USA. When they were setting off atomic bombs in the 1940s, they were sending a very, very clear message to whoever it is that might be coming back on 2012. The Trinity tests, which are officially logged as taking place on July the 12th, although I could go into a bit more on that, but that took place at 33 degrees north. Hiroshima was 34 degrees north and Nagasaki was 32 degrees north. The 6th of August 1945, when you add 6, 8, 1, 9, 4, 5, you got 33. They encoded the 33. Now, nuclear explosions, just like sunspots, can be seen right out in deep space. Were they sending a message to whoever it is that they think and they believe might be about to return to say, hey, we're ready for you? Let me just read this. Our race is the master race. We are divine gods on this planet. We are as different from the inferior races as they are from insects. In fact, compared to our race, other races are beasts and animals, cattle at best. Other races are considered as human excrement. Our destiny is to rule over the inferior races. Our earthly kingdom will be ruled by our leader with a rod of iron. The masses will lick our feet and serve us as our slaves. Any idea who said that? Hitler. Yeah, I would have thought that too. It's Menachem Begin. Many of the Israelis, many Jewish scholars know that their covenant is with Enlil, not the true creator of man. In the US, as Andy mentioned, there is Operation Endgame, an archipelago of concentration camps that came to light in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. 600 camps empty, a budget of 46 million to man these camps empty. What are they there for? What are they planning? What are they expecting? Yeah, America, I was in America just a few weeks ago, and I tell you what, it felt like going behind enemy lines. I mean, it is impossible to travel comfortably. I mean, you've got to strip off every time you get an internal flight almost. It is amazing. It is a police state. But, perhaps this is all good news. There is no question. There are many prophecies, many accounts from all around the world that point to this particular juncture in time being very, very significant. I'm not suggesting that these guys have got it right. It's what they believe. It's what they have had access to, hidden access to, through the last couple of millennia. And they are countering the possibility that maybe somebody's about to return on 2012 on Mount Hermon. And maybe, as per we'll hear tomorrow from Jeff, we reach the end of the fifth sun in the Mayan calendar on December 21st, 2012. There are many other encodings. I don't have time to go into them. Even the Roswell crash, even the trajectory in which the Roswell crash came into being, points to Mount Hermon. I mean, it is staggering. There are many other aspects that point to Mount Hermon. This is not an isolated case. But last year, this crop circle appeared. Immediately it hit me, representative of the Mayan ball game, which John Major Jenkins talks about in his book, Cosmogenesis 2012, and talks about the ball game being representative of the need to regenerate, of transformation of the earth on a regular basis. We see many crop circles with the Kundalini rising, again, ancient Egyptian wisdom. Another aspect of the 33 in this case representing the 33 vertebrae of the spine, and the journey, the 3.5 times that the Kundalini goes around the spine on the journey from the sacrum, the sacred bone, to the temple. And we, I think, can see that we're getting a lot of help with this. 2 crop circles again from last year, which appeared either side of Aldbourne, which suggested to me, this interference pattern. That this is a period of chaos. But perhaps the suggestion that we shouldn't be too worried about it. Wayland Smithy, I actually went up to this circle the other day. I had no idea, by the way, that we were going to go there. I went to the Crop Circle Cafe and we met up with Jeff and Helen, and there was a party that had just come back, so we knew the circle was still up. And we drove up to Wayland Smithy, which is quite away from the Crop Circle Cafe. We walked into it, amazing circle. When I got back to my car, the last 3 digits on my mileometer were 911. It also, by the way, and I'm not going to go into this right now, but I think it also may well be representative of solar flares. And maybe that's something I'll discuss when I'm invited back next, if I'm invited back. I talked about this last year, the aggressive Piscean. I have another take on this now, because here we have the representation of Pisces. Pisces is the representation of Enlil. So we have come to an end of the age of Enlil. So perhaps the watchers coming to Earth, sentenced to their 5,500 years, were under the guise of Enlil. And here we have the waters, the Aquarian waters, representing, as I thought last year, the waters of Aquarius, washing over the Piscean, the aggressive Piscean, obviously not giving up the game lightly. But the waters, the other name of Enki is eau. The word still exists in French for water. So it's the waters of eau, waters of Enki, washing over Enlil. Now, why does Enki have an interest? Because Enki was the creator of man, and Enki actually sort of set the evolutionary process in motion, and he wanted to see how man could progress spiritually. Now, what we are seeing at the moment is people that are totally locked into their, physical, material realm, and other people who are extracting themselves from this. And there is as I said last night, perhaps a duality in terms of perception. Now, this is my pièce de résistance here. This is Tibet. And there is a wonderful piece of Tibetan wisdom which really sort of brings, for me, everything that's occurring. And that piece of wisdom is, the greatest service that anybody can do for your soul development is to be your enemy. So consider the possibility that these guys are fulfilling a major, major role in the awakening process. Until 9/11, I was doing my stuff. In fact, I spent most of 1998 playing golf. I spent most of 2000 and 2001 doing some research in Central America or laying on the beach. Life was good. 2001 went down, and it changed my whole approach. It launched me onto a research path that until July of last year, I was doing pretty much alone. In the last 12 months, I have hooked into an amazing network of researchers. And some of those researchers have contributed to this presentation today. So we are growing. We're getting a lot of help. We are moving in the right direction. And there is no question that what is occurring for a good reason. These guys, perhaps they're stars. Perhaps they're very, very advanced souls. Perhaps we should recognize their contribution. Perhaps they are sacrificing themselves and their own soul development to give us the chance to get out of our apathy. Okay. So, we have the alchemical process. There are players that would very much like to keep the wisdom separate from the masses. But this crop circle appeared a few years ago in Highclere, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And I believe this was telling us that now is the time for that knowledge and that wisdom to be returned to the masses. And it is up to us how we make use of it. Now we can take a back seat and let it all go on around us and say, yeah, it's all going to work out. This is a game. And right now, this is the only game in town. And there are a number of us who are working the front line. We are trying to bridge the worlds, but we are trying to encourage other people through many different mediums to see the opportunity that they have. And all the support that we can get, and all the support that those people can get, would be much appreciated. Solveo coagular, a classic part of the alchemical process. You have to destroy to be able to rebuild. Now, there are players here who have very different plans on what that rebuilding process will be. We have to work to be sure that we are taking that initiative. In all of us, there is darkness and there is light. Every one of us should recognize that, there is darkness, there is evil within inside of us. We are all capable of it. And it is our shadow self. And the challenge is to embrace that shadow, embrace it, and utilize it, and move forward, and become whole. Come on. This was the last crop circle to appear last year. The classic Egyptian symbol of transformation. The dung beetle, Kepra, pushing the sun disk, the solar bark, across the sky of 1,000,000 years. Whatever it is that's about to occur will be even more amazing than we can ever think of anyway. I mean, that's a given. But it's an indication that, this is just part of the process. There's a great quote. Anyone can tell me where it comes from, is that, simply that to the well-ordered mind, death is but the next step in the great adventure. Anybody know which great philosopher that came from? Well done, twice, in the Philosopher's Stone. This is where we're at right now. Many of us here are able and have had the opportunity to see through the veil. But this is the realm in which we are working right now. The game is here. Our challenge is here. And it is about sending out love. It is about embracing every aspect of humanity and reclaiming effectively what is our birthright. And I believe that within the next few years, as I know many of you do, that we will do that. And that what we will see, as I said, will be even more amazing than we can imagine. But nonetheless, we cannot sit back. Now, I'm going to close. I got you singing on the way in. I'm going to get you singing on the way out. I hope. I've even put the words up for you, so please join me in the chorus of this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Ian Crane. Thank you, Ian. Fantastic.